Okay, this is session 10, and we are talking about time and motion. Motion and time are related ideas. We understand motion because something changes position, and any kind of change requires time to accomplish it. And time is understood in its passage by motion, by change in position. So one easy way to understand the idea of motion in the two-dimensional realm in a static image is simply to create a sense of change, in this case scale, and also change in position. So we have a sense of movement and sequencing as our eye travels from point A to point B to point C and so forth. Time is a duration. A duration is a measured thing. It has a start and it has an end, and we deal in time all the time, and we each have the same amount of time and divide our days and evenings in different ways to accommodate schedules and activities and so forth. And everything we do has a start and a finish to it. So time is very much a temporal understanding, and we understand hours in a day and minutes in an hour and seconds in a minute. We understand morning, afternoon, evening. In nautical terms, if you sail or have been in the military, you understand the idea of watches during the night. And so forth. So there's various ways of dividing the day, various ways of dividing time, and understanding the passage of time. Time relates to the Gestalt principle of continuity in that it is a moving issue. We can't go back to the starting point, and we start all over again in some ways, but we don't start new with time. Time is one of those things that we cannot reuse. So it's an interesting concept that it's a resource that we have, but we cannot reuse it. It's gone once it's gone. Within two-dimensional understanding, there is a variety of ways we depict time and motion. Most two-dimensional images are static, and the viewer's eye will move through the design space, and we've already talked about pattern and rhythm, which is an idea of movement and so forth. And so the image remains stationary while the viewer's eye travels around in it. So as we're looking at this, of course, we're seeing the figure and the hands out and so forth, and then we're seeing each of these bits of paper floating. And we understand that because of assimilation, the Gestalt principle of assimilation, these pieces are depicted as being in a state of motion, and because they can't be suspended on their own in reality. So we have an understanding that these things are moving even though the movement has been caught and created into a still image. But we are moving from one point to another point over these bits of paper. And we notice that also that some are larger and then some are smaller, and there's various angles and so forth. So there is a kind of a random, haphazard idea of a pattern here, and we understand some spatial depth, and our eye is traveling all around this, and the figure basically remains kind of a framework, a stationary point that brings focus to these bits of paper. Two-dimensionally, anything that is dynamic would have actual movement to it. Clocks are an obvious example of that. Door handles that turn, faucets, windows that you open and close, things like that. Those have an animated quality to them, and that they do actually move. In a still image, anticipated movement is very common, especially if you're looking at an illustration or something that is actually telling a story. The idea of anticipated movement is aided by the use of diagonals. and also curves, but there is a suggestion that something is happening and we are anticipate something to occur within the design, within the image. And so as we're looking at this illustration, we see the kids on the shore, we see the choppiness of the ocean water, the birds in flight, hovering as if, we've seen seagulls just kind of hang there in the air a little bit as the wind kicks up. And then we see in the background the giant walking by with long strides, and the clouds are all on diagonals and they're looking kind of stormy and billowy, like there's a lot of wind or a lot of movement. The angle of the giant himself, he's definitely moving from left to right. He's ignoring the kids, he's intent on what he's doing, and the kids are rising in anticipation. If you'll notice, each one of them is pretty much at some sort of angle, some sort of suspended animated state. They are in motion, and they are rising to their feet to watch this guy pass. So we've created a lot of movement just in terms of the repeated diagonals, in terms of things being suspended in kind of a stop motion understanding. Kinetic is dynamic. It's actually something that does move, and so again, clocks fall into that category. This obviously is a bicycle made out of wood, and I don't know that it negotiates curves and things like that really well, or turns corners really well, but it certainly is an interesting design to look at. But this would be a kinetic piece. It is a three-dimensional form, and we have the understanding that this will roll from point A to point B in some way. And so the idea of kinetic motion happens mostly three-dimensionally. In two dimensions, kinetic motion is animation and motion graphics, film, video, things like that for the most part. In a still image, there's various devices that we can use to create motion. Remember that a device is a means or a visual tool, the application of a particular principle to create a sense of something. We talked about spatial devices for plastic space and for flat space earlier on in the quarter, and there are devices, means, tools, methods, principles to apply to create the idea of motion. One of those is repetition, and obviously repetition starts creating pattern, and pattern has movement and so forth, and so there is within repetition just the idea of motion. And we have in this Bob Ziering drawing of this is of newscasters probably about 15 years ago, but the repeated hands, the repeated eyes, the portraits as we move across the design space. And so there's a lot of movement in this just through repeating the physical features of each individual who's represented. Another device that we use is blurring, and creating fuzzy edges or creating a sense of linear movement through the idea of blurring. And so as we look at this book cover, obviously everything about it is blurred except for the title and the author's name. And so we have the drummer in kind of a camera blur going on. Then there is a two-dimensional field that's got a decorative pattern on it, which is also blurred, so we can actually start feeling the vibration of the drums as they're being pounded. And then the contrast of the real crisp and clean letter forms breaks that out, and so we can actually read the title of the book and the author. Multiple image is another way that we create a sense of motion going from point A to point B. And if you're familiar with Edward Muybridge, a photographer from a while back, He's kind of the father of motion graphics and animation. But there's been, just in terms of catching still images out of a motion graphic or video or animation, gives us a sense of movement. And also here there's overlapping and transparency, which is helping the idea of the bird. It's helping to express the flight of the bird and the motion of the wings. Use of diagonals. Recall back in the N.C. Wyeth illustration that we looked at a few minutes ago, everything was on the diagonal pretty much. Here also we have a real strong contrast between the vertical upright figure and the geese that are all kind of taking flight on the diagonal. So the motion of the geese is increased. That sense of movement from lower right to upper left has been increased because of the addition of the stationary guy. And so you get a sense of the wings stirring up the breeze, and not fast movement really, but just a kind of a slow rise and then kicking off into the air as the birds are taking flight. So contrasting a diagonal with an upright or a horizontal, a vertical or a horizontal, will actually increase the sense of motion in the diagonal. Cropping. Cropping is where you cut off something in an image. It's basically open form, open composition. And strategic cropping is where the image or the design just doesn't bleed off the page and is cropped by the edges, but strategic cropping involves cropping for specific effect. In this case, the dancer on the right has been cropped, and that gives us, of course, focus into the dancer in the background, but this gives us a strong sense of things being in motion. She is kind of perhaps talking to somebody out of the picture frame, and she of course is moving, but there's a lot of implied line from the hand down the skirt, and that would be an intentional thing in the design of the space. Also notice the implied line here to the eyes and then to the top of the head. So there's a lot of diagonals going on in here as well, and if you're looking at this astutely, you're going to pick up all of those implied lines. And you could probably even lay a piece of tracing paper over this and just diagram out all the diagonals, and you'll get a strong sense of movement there. But the cropping of the figure and the openness of the composition creates a strong sense of movement, just in terms of the figures are engaged in activity and we've caught them at a moment in time. Multiple image, again, like the birds we just saw, can help create a sense of motion, but also a sense of time. This photograph is really interesting because it's a composite of about 24 different photos, pieces of 24 different photos that are all shot from the same vantage point, from the same eye level and so forth, and just at different times of day. So we go from morning into evening and into nighttime in the span of the distance of this photo. And of course you can see the sequencing of the vertical bars, the vertical sections, and then putting this all together. It creates one entire unit that communicates really well, but at the same time it's broken up from morning into night. And there's a sense of motion, there's a sense of time. Curves help create motion as well. Just the rhythmic movement, the change of direction on a curve, whether the curve is swift or it's a lot slower. So we have a sense of the female figure definitely in motion, kicking up her heels, and somewhat joyful as well. And then of course the drop shadow on the guy is doing the same thing. but there's a sense of her being animated, even though it's a static image. We get the sense of she's doing something. She's not just standing there. Devices that help us depict time include things like distance and diminishment. So in this photograph, we are standing in the middle of a road next to a really old truck and looking down the road toward the car that's way down here. There's a dog, there's a guy, there is a sense of distance, and anytime we have distance, we have the sense of having to cover that distance to get from point A, where we are, to point B. So if we're going to be walking to this car, that's going to take a few minutes, and we're going to pass the dog, and we're going to nod to the guy, and so forth. And so just the sense of having to go from here to there gives us a sense of time. So diminishment, linear perspective, a sense of distance will help create a sense of time. Here's Edward Muybridge, and again, sequencing is a device that we can use to create a sense of time, going from one pose into the natural follow-on to another natural follow-on, and so forth, and coming back to stationary. So here we are galloping, here we are in the air, suspended, and starting to hit the ground, and rolling on each of the hooves in turn, and then are actually there's some missing images here probably, because we wouldn't go from here right to here without a few things in between, but the idea is there that there's a sense of movement. Movement requires time, and so a sequence of related images going from one thing into another, into another, into another shows the idea of time passing. Linear movement as well. We use timelines a lot. We will use flowcharts. We will devise schedules and plans in a linear fashion. And we'll use Gantt charts and things like that in setting up projects and scheduling. You know, we're going to have the framers come in here. We're going to have the guys come in and pour the foundation. We're going to put up the framing and start laying in the drywall. Then we're going to have the electrical guys come in at this point, and the plumbers coming in to do their thing at this point. Then the inspector shows up here at this point, and so forth, in terms of the entire project that we're dealing with. And that's all a time understanding. And as you devise and schedule your projects from start to completion, you will be dealing with chunks of time, with durations, that this needs to happen by this time, and this needs to happen by this time, and certain things have to happen before other things can happen. So you have to plan your time on any project. And so linear movement is very much a part of your design process and your planning process in terms of putting your design projects together. And this cartoon rough out just basically shows a sense of starting and kind of building up momentum and then shooting off in a linear direction. And probably with the sense of speed that we have, just there's a quick instance of, you know, gearing up to launch, and the launching, and then the disappearing is where we've taken flight out of the picture plane. But that linear movement will definitely show a passage of time, no matter how short it is. Another way we depict time is change. One of the most obvious ways that you'll encounter the understanding of time is in change of lighting in an interior from morning to evening. Morning light appears differently than evening light, and colors will change within the different light qualities and things like that. And as the light changes in position, the sunlight changes in position during the day, shadows will have movement within a room over the course of a day. And so that's change. So change is a very obvious way to depict time because change requires time. There's very few things that we deal with that change instantaneously. And the sequence that's depicted here is actually a piece of animation, and it is showing as if a camera is up close and then it's changing in position and drawing back so that to reveal the full figure with the hat, and then drawing away from it. So we're really close, getting details on the hat, then we pull back and we kind of move around the figure and start seeing, oh, there's there's kind of a face there and so forth, and then we move around behind back to the hat again, and then keep going, and then the figure goes off into the distance, it disappears. So change, each one of these storyboard boxes has a different element in it, but it relates to the one before it and to the one after it, and it changes. Another way we can just show that is the idea of an infant growing into an adult over time, obviously, and then the various changes they go through physically as they mature into adulthood, and then as they reach their full height, and then they keep maturing from youth into old age and so forth. So change is a constant thing in our lives. So let's review a few things. So non-objective form are shapes that don't represent anything. They would be the geometrics and rectilinears and curvilinears that are basically just shapes of various sorts. Hieratic scaling is increasing the size of something based on the importance. We see that a lot with Greek and Roman art. We see it a lot with illuminated manuscripts and art from before the Renaissance time. We see it a lot with movie posters, where the main character, the hero of the story, is going to be larger than life in the design space, and supporting characters and supporting activity and circumstances are secondary in size. Negative shape is negative space that actually has a complete form around it. It is surrounded and framed off, and so it is a specific shape-oriented thing, but it's negative space. Value key, remember value relates to lightness and darkness, relates to the Gestalt principle of irradiation, that we see form because of lightness and darkness. We recognize edges and figure ground by virtue of light-dark contrast. So value is light-dark understanding of any color. And the key is the overall idea within the design. So the idea is that you will have a high key, which is overall light in value, mid key, which is overall kind of mid-gray in value, and then a low key, which is overall dark. Serial design are series of pieces that comprise an entire unit, but they're separate designs, but they all relate to each other. So basically it's a series of related pieces. Color constancy is the idea that we will be able to recognize color on an object accurately under any lighting situation, basically because we as human beings receive light waves in a proportional ratio. So a blue object will always reflect more blue light waves than a green object. So even under a colored lighting situation, the blue object will always be absorbing most everything but blue, and the green will absorb most everything but green, and so we'll still be able to differentiate the blue from the green under a colored light source. Cameras don't do that. Cameras will actually, under say a red light, they'll just pretty much show everything as really heavily red. We will be able to actually pick out color subtleties because we don't see like cameras do. Design is the arrangement of elements in a given space. It's planned and it's deliberate, it's thoughtful. An equivocal space is basically figure-ground ambiguity where figure and ground are not differentiated. And equivocal space is the end result, the third panel of Project 2, if you recall that with the letter forms. Bilateral symmetry is basically dividing an image in half. It can, with an axis, it is symmetry, and you have basically equal distance and equal things happening on one side and the other. Bilateral symmetry can divide horizontally, vertically, or diagonally. Axis is basically the direction off the fulcrum, and it's the basis for balance. And you will have axes in symmetrical balance and approximate symmetry, in asymmetry, and in the cruciform balance, in the radial balance idea. There are no axes in crystallographic balance. A module is a unit that is repeated. It's basically a unit of space, of shape, that's repeated throughout a design. So when you divide a design space up into a structural understanding, you have a variety of modules that make up the whole thing. So a module is a specific unit that you're working with, that you multiply to create your overall design space. Eye level relates to how high your eyes are from the ground plane. If you're sitting down, you reduce your eye level or decrease it. If you stand up on a ladder, you are increasing your eye level. You are raising it. And as we look at the photo of Johnny Cash, we understand that eye level is from the photographer's point of view, or where the camera is. And eye level is about at his left hand on top of the guitar case. And so we're looking up at Johnny Cash, who is the subject. So this is not taken from the subject's eye level, but from the photographer's eye level. The type of balance in this photo is approximate symmetry. Value pattern is understanding repetition of light-dark. We have value pattern going on in the reeds. We have value pattern going on in the sky and in the ground, where we have the little bits of dark and then the lighter mid-value colors going on. Value pattern occurs whether it's a man-made pattern or whether it's an existing pattern like, you know, dog fur or something like that. Sequence is a series, a planned, methodical repetition of something. So in this painting we have a sequence of arches and a sequence of windows. Gestalt is wholeness, the totality of the design. Tonality is the idea of color dominance, like value key. Is it warm or is it cool? Is it overall red? Is it overall blue? So the tonality of a piece relates to the dominant color in the piece and how that pervades everything within the design. This basically is warm, and we have some cooler blues, of course, at the corners, but most everything has warm tonalities to it. So the color dominance is on the yellows and the pinks and the oranges and so forth, and they're all tinted. This is a mid-key in terms of value painting, but it's a warm tonality. The spatial understanding is plastic. We have a sense of volumetric illusion. Light logic is definitely involved. The angle of the light is understood by the shadows that the arches are making on the facade of the building. And the subject of this, of course, is the building. So subject is basically what's being depicted in the design. Critique is an evaluation for purposes of recognizing strengths and weaknesses, for the purposes of learning and improving one's design ability. Critique is something that you should always be doing, and it's not the same as criticism. Critique is looking at something with a critical eye, using critical thinking and saying, yes, this works, no, this doesn't, and understanding why and how to make it work. Integration is the idea of figure and ground kind of blending together in certain areas within a design or within an image. It's usually volumetric space, plastic space that uses integration, not always. But it's basically where figure ground come together and you have lost boundaries or lost contours. Horizontal balance is basically the idea of pictorial balance, where you're balancing the right side and the left side via a vertical axis. So there's a vertical axis dividing the space, but then the balance is side to side, not top to bottom. After image is, of course, where we are looking at something, taking in a color, and the rods and cones are becoming fatigued on our retina, and then we look away and we see the opposite of the color that we're looking at. And that was all explained when we were talking about color. Kinetic empathy is being able to look at something and empathize with it in terms of what's going on. It relates to a Gestalt idea of assimilation, specifically correspondence. The idea that, you know, if we see somebody go sliding off their bike onto the street, we can we understand what that feels like if it's ever happened to us before, if we've ever fallen down and skinned a knee, and we see somebody do that, there's this ouch, you know, kind of response that we have that is empathetic to the situation. So given any design, any painting, any photograph in which something is happening that we have experience with or that we have seen before, there is an empathetic understanding in which we relate to what's going on within the image. We understand, how that's done, or we've done that, and so we know what that person's going through.